Thanks, Audrine. First, before I introduce Jenny, I just wanted to let you know that as you all know, you're here because tomatoes are a popular topic and they have lots of mysteries among gardeners and among farmers alike. And so we've invited Jenny here today, even though this is part of the Master Gardener Green Thumb lecture series. We also asked her to speak to local producers and farmers as well. So we hope that we have both in the audience, and we hope that everybody learns a lot about tomatoes. So Jenny Glass, I'm so pleased to have her. She is the diagnostician at the WSU Puyallup Plant and Insect Diagnostic Clinic. She's been there for 2 decades, and she has a huge amount of experience diagnosing plant problems of all sorts. She has a particular familiarity with solanaceous plants, having interacted with them throughout her life as a child, as a Peace Corps volunteer, as a grad student, and a diagnostician, but I'll let her tell those stories. I've had the pleasure of working with her for many years, sending problems from master gardeners and from farmers that stump us, and she helps us out. So we're very pleased to have Jenny join us today.
Hi, everybody. Okay, so the first thing to do is to see what kind of a diagnostician I am. What do you see for my slides? Do you see the slide itself, which you should hopefully see now, or do you see nothing? Let's figure that out first.
Jenny, right now I see tips for diagnosing tomato plant problems, as well as your speaker view or your presenter's view in your PowerPoint.
Okay. Pause the share. Okay, let's see. Resume share. Did that fix anything?
No. Well, you still need to go back to the slideshow, and from the beginning, then we'll have just the hopefully your full slide without your PowerPoint background. There you go.
Okay, perfect. Because I know what I'm doing, but this particular computer seems to disappear either the Zoom controls or the things that I just can't figure it out both of them. So anyway, welcome everybody. Wanted to talk to you today about tomato problems. We have an hour. We could probably spend the rest of the summer talking about them. But you know, my goal as a diagnostician is to help people solve issues and better yet, try to avoid them. So I love opportunities like this to come talk about things that are out there on your, a crop and try to avoid them because of prevention is such a much better way of dealing with problems than actually solving the problem when it occurs. So just take a minute here to kind of get ourselves ready for the next hour. I just wanted to say thank you all. And I just wanted to plug out, I mean, I already heard it from Audrey, but what a great time it is to be a part of WSU Extension. We are looking into, the equity, diversity, justice lens like we have never looked at before. So I just wanted to take a moment to think about the Native people who have taken care of this land, and now we're a part of that story. Do our best when we're talking about plant problems to remember that, well, wonderful succulent tomato is great. We also need to, work on the soil, protect the beneficials, make sure we're not doing anything to hurt the salmon, those kind of things. And then just, a comment to everybody that appreciate all the things that we all do to protect dignity of all people. So in all honesty, I will show you my picture of my tomatoes in my garden today. Okay, it's pretty pathetic, but I'm very excited for 2 reasons. One, you will see that these row of tomatoes, there's 7 of them. They're in the ground. That never even happened last year. So yay, things are going on. And 2, I had a neighbor gave me a little greenhouse. And so I threw them at some small starts into there and was pretty erratic about taking care of them. And yet I did manage not to kill any of them, even though they have now officially survived drought, cold, heat, and just about every other stress before they even got into the ground. So wanted to be totally honest with you. What I'm going to talk about today is mostly the stuff that comes into the diagnostic lab. So that's, you know, the common stuff sometimes, but it's also the more unusual stuff. And then I really wanted to make sure that this was somewhat interactive. So feel free to use the chat box to ask questions, and I'll try to keep an eye on those. And then definitely we'll want some time at the end to talk about those questions. And of course, I went to look at the chat box and now I can't control the slides. Story of my life. Oh, there it is. Okay. So one of the first things I think is super important for anybody growing, you know, a tomato or any other plant is that you think about it first. You know, and of course, as you just saw in that last picture, magical thinking isn't the best because I'm always got great plans for my garden and stuff like that. And yet, you know, do I actually get as far as I want? So I love this chart from the extension, North Carolina extension thing, because they were talking about how, you know, really integrated pest management is a ton of effort, mostly cerebral. And then as you, you know, work up to it, then you have to do the actions and stuff like that. So the first step of any plant problem when you see it is to try to figure out, okay, you know, what is going on? What is going on relative to my situation? Is there, you know, something I can do about it or whatever? So the example here is something that I see just about every year. Sometimes it comes from a home garden, a lot of times it comes from a commercial operation. And what they are is they're little tomatoes in spring that have some distortion, and then you can see that really white colored cells all over the leaf. And it isn't yellow. I mean, there's a lot of yellow in the picture, but the white on the leaf is really a white color. And when you see discoloration like that, one of the first things that comes to people's mind is virus infections, or perhaps contact with a herbicide that damages the chloroplasts, various other really big stresses. And yet there is a condition called the chimera, which is the genetic makeup of certain plants, and tomatoes and fig trees and, you know, a whole bunch of other plants and animals have this issue where there are two genetic components that kind of make up the entire whole. So this is just a natural thing that occurred to the plant, a natural mutation. It's nothing harmful. It's not going to spread to anything else. It's only on the ones that that had this thing. Now, occasionally you'll see it more than once in especially if you're planting, you know, hundreds of tomatoes. And what that means is that, you know, that one fruit that had this problem in it and got into the seed ended up in that batch of seeds that you either saved or you purchased. And so in this case, you know, basically most people would probably not do much with it any further because there's going to be some, you know, white cells instead of photosynthetic cells, and it might slow down the plant's production. I was given this plant this spring, and so I am kind of curious just to see what happens. And so, you know, I have nothing to lose in my backyard, so I planted it out just to see, you know, what anything was going to do. But if you jump to the conclusion that every time you saw something distorted and discolored, it was a virus, you're just not, you know, it's a great hypothesis. It's just not always going to be accurate, and you might find yourself, you know, panicking more than you need to, or destroying plants that don't need to be destroyed or something like that. So think, plan, and then you do. So this could be like when you're setting up your garden bed, how often have you rotated crops out of that particular spot? So do you grow tomatoes year after year after year after year in the same area? And I will admit that, yeah, that's pretty much what I do. I have a small yard. I have one area that's sunny, and so that's what's happening. But I'm also, as a plant pathologist, know that this is a really dumb idea, and that I'm potentially asking for trouble should I develop a disease in the soil like verticillium wilt or white mold or something like that. So if you have more area to plan, then you'd want to plan. You know, take a couple year focus on the thing. Okay, I'm going to plant the tomatoes in this part of the garden or this part of the field. I'm going to do that for a year or two, and then I'm going to rotate it into, say, carrots or something else, you know, so you get some mix up of the families. And then what we often, lives are so busy. So what often happens is that, things are trucking along and then all of a sudden you notice a humongous problem. Well, if we'd been out spending a bit of time looking carefully a day, a week earlier, we might have noticed the problem when it was smaller and probably much more manageable. So you want to get out there and monitor and try to figure these things out. And then at some point, the question is the problem I'm seeing, is it going to be damaging? Is it going to be something that's going to harm my tomato crop? And so at that point, you might be counting the number of aphids. You might be investigating the symptoms you're seeing to see if it's a really serious foliar disease or if it's just something that, you can live and let live with. You may be sending, some pictures into your master gardeners or your county agent or the diagnostic lab. And at some point, hopefully not all the time, but you're going to have to do some sort of action. And that action will be your integrated pest management stuff. That'll be things like you may remove some of the leaves of your tomato plant for better air circulation. Super helpful if you're dealing with a fungal infection. You may go out at night and try to squish all the larvae that are crawling on the tomatoes, feeding on the leaves and on the fruit. So there's all sorts of different things we want to do. But I just wanted to remind everybody that prevention is really how most of the diagnosis works. And so to make sure you think that through, this particular diagram is in the notes section that I remembered I didn't yet tack on, but I'm sure somebody will tack it into the notes or put it later at the end. So you don't have to scroll, write all this down. And then one of the most important things, and I saw many of your names today and people I've been working with for years and stuff like that. So get to know the tomato. This is definitely something that needs to happen. Most of us recognize that tomatoes like slightly acidic soils. They typically need a lot of full sun. They are heat lovers, and so the warmer it gets, especially at night, the happier a tomato is going to be growing. And then, experienced growers and experienced master gardeners know that, while they might have memories of some, fantastic beefsteak tomato that they grew up with in the Midwest in their childhood, out here in Western Washington probably isn't going to have enough days to mature that thing. So you'd be better off, picking one of the shorter days to maturity plants. And there's a lot of them out there that work just great. And if for some reason you fail to meet all these needs, that's when you're going to start to see problems. And so you're going to see usually a very uniform distribution of the problem if it's something related to unmet needs. So the plant may not grow very well. I remember one time where I was talking to a grower down in the south of the state, and he was just panicking because his seedlings were not growing very well. And was it a disease? Was it, what was it? He was all, and I said, well, are you doing anything different this year? And he admitted that because of, fuel costs, he had cranked down the heater a little bit. I said, well, how much? And then he told me, and I said, well, the fact that it's been relatively cold, you're at this low temperature. My guess is that, your plants are probably growing great for the conditions you're giving them. And, if you want them to grow the way you expect, you're going to have to give them the conditions they need. And that's heating them up a little bit more. And then I said, please do send in a sample. We will, happy to look at it for diseases and pests. And by the time the sample arrived in 3 days, he cranked up the temperature just a couple degrees. And when I called him up to report, there really wasn't anything there. He basically didn't even remember the problem because my urging him to heat it up a little bit was all that was needed to get those plants growing. Pale color, necrotic spots, those kind of things. These are often associated with nutrient issues. And, depending on how much effort you put into your soils. And I'm laughing because I think there's, some people that would be here today, but they're sitting over in the administration building learning about soils. So we have a 3-day soil workshop here today. but I've often had issues where, people have worked on beautiful soil blends and then they still have nutrient problems and they're like, what's going on? Well, sometimes it's a case where even though the nutritional blend was great, it's not at a form that's available to the plants. Maybe it needs to be a little warmer so all the microorganisms that break those nutrients down are able to break the nutrient down and get it to the plant. Other times, a mix that worked great for several years, one of the suppliers got changed and all of a sudden, like maybe the peat or something like that came in much more salty than somebody's unmuted. So if you could mute yourself, that'd be great. Thank you. So people have seen salt burn to the roots. And then of course, if the roots get burnt, it doesn't matter how beautiful your soil mix is or how much nutrients it is, you're going to have problems because the plant needs those fine feeder roots in order to pick up the nutrients. So this particular, tomato featured in this slide, you can see how it is not a very healthy color. It's a pale yellow. And for those of us with, good eyesight, you can see little tiny necrotic spots down between the main veins. And those spots, definitely make you a little worried. But if you pulled your hand lens out, you'd see no signs of any, fungal sporulation structures. And then you would notice that on all the leaves, they're all between the veins. And so, a pathogen such as a bacteria or a fungus most likely would be able to show up at random on a leaf. And when you see a limited pattern, like just between the veins, then you're, got some evidence that suggests that something's a stress or a abiotic problem, not a disease or a pest. So keep that in mind. And so lots of what I see in the lab, especially in spring, is what I call the diseases, actually disorders of anticipation. People want to, they're dreaming of tomatoes, and yet it's still, 55 degrees or 50 degrees at night. The day might be kind of warm, but it's pretty cold at night, and that doesn't help things. So I often walk around at the garden stores and talk to the tomatoes. And tomatoes, you just got pulled out of a nice greenhouse. You were growing so well, and now you're going to be sitting for 3 weeks in somebody's backyard in Tacoma here. And I'm sorry, hang in there. It will get better. Kind of a feel. And then just, some patterns here on these pictures, as you can see that the yellow on the one on the left is pretty much around the margin. So that's going to be suggesting maybe some root problems or something like that that's preventing the nutrient from getting it. The one on the right, in addition to some distortion, there's also a bunch of bright yellow leaves. And yet the more yellow the leaf is, the older it is. And so in this case, it's probably something like nitrogen deficiency, where again, probably is, not limited. Nitrogen isn't limited in the soil, most likely. These are still in pots. I'm sure they've got, a good growing mix in there, but the environment that allows the microorganisms to break the nutrients down and make it available to the plant just isn't helping. And so in almost all these cases, when people bring them in, one of the first things I say is, what time of year is it? How warm is it? How cold is it? Give it some time. See if you can put a tent over it and heat it up a little bit, not to worry too much. There is, the other key feature is understanding that there's a why behind the what. And so, for example, purplish purplish discoloration here on the leaves of this tomato. Purple discoloration is usually potassium deficiency, but again, probably isn't going to be that it isn't present in the soil, it's that it's unavailable to the soil. So this could be things like cool soils. Again, sometimes we'll see deficiency for the opposite reason, too hot and too dry at the end of the season. And then I was asked by Tony to talk about blossom end rot, which is a calcium, in the literature, you'd say it says calcium deficiency, but that really isn't what's going on here. The thing that's deficient is the fruit, but probably nowhere else is it deficient. So not like the soil or something like that. But what's happening is that the tomato plant is unable to utilize or activate the calcium that's around it. So fertilizing in this case typically doesn't solve the problem. Instead, what does solve the problem is managing the watering very carefully in order to make sure that calcium doesn't go out of alignment or out of sync with the plant. So, you know, there's a bunch of questions about, you know, what was I thinking? How do you water thoroughly or infrequently? Do you water regularly in order to do this? And it kind of depends on just, you know, what the conditions are, where you're growing, etc. So one of the first things that I've noticed in my, you know, 2 decades is, you know, blossom end rot used to be a pretty common, I mean, it's always been common, but it used to be much more common on the really big tomatoes that took a lot of time to mature. And now we get it all sorts of places. And one of the things that often happens is that many people are trying to grow tomatoes in pots, often on their patio, sometimes in containers in hoop houses or greenhouses. And for managing water, that's really, really difficult because it dries in and dries out. And so basically what you're going to be wanting to do is you're going to be wanting to make sure that the water is relatively even, so it doesn't go through the saturated drought types of things. And, you know, it really is going to depend on the variety of tomato you grow, your soil type, you know, so there's no real one good answer. But the other thing to remember is you're trying to, you know, grow a tomato that is much more tasty and wonderful than, say, the stuff you can buy at the grocery store. So whatever you do, don't overwater either, because if you overwater a tomato, you're going to get a boring, watery tomato, and that's no fun. See a question about pinch off flowers in the beginning and what point do you let them grow? And that's a great question, but that is a horticulture question. And I am a plant pathologist, not a horticulturalist. So what I would say is, you know, if you are having a nutrient deficiency issue, flowers and fruit are going to be a nutrient sink. So, I mean, that would definitely be a time when you might want to pluck off some early growth. But from a common horticultural practice, I do not know that, but I also know that one of the things especially for people who are growing in greenhouses and in hoop houses where humidity gets higher, a lot of pruning will really help you out on a variety of fungal infection diseases like gray mold or leaf mold and stuff like that, because you need a lot of air circulation and stuff like that. So, you know, just plopping them in those conditions and letting the plant grow may not be in your best interest. So then those were kind of the last part. There is this stuff I call, I wonder why, what? I'm sorry. One question here about blossom end rot. So the inconsistent watering, yes, Amy, is the main issue. So if the plant dries out and then it doesn't get the calcium it needs, so doing something like squirting calcium into the soil or squirting calcium into the plant is not going to help, you know, if the plant's under a water deficiency types of issue. So then one other thing that happens all the time every spring, I don't think there's been a spring where this hasn't happened yet, although maybe this year, just because it's so darn cold, nothing is growing, is the I wonder what's. And sadly, I wish that was an actual, you know, diagnostic thing I could get away with. But it's not. And what happens is that various growing conditions, whether it's inside someone's home, on the porch, in a greenhouse, in addition to, you know, a plant starts out usually relatively okay looking, and then suddenly starts to curl, twist, turn yellow, and do all sorts of very, very bizarre stuff. And the truth is, it could be just about anything that would do this, because again, your symptoms or how the plant's responding to the problem is plant dependent, and plants often respond in the same way to a whole host of things. So when somebody calls me up with one of these things, I know that what's going to happen next is we are going to ask a lot of questions. We're going to think about a lot of ideas, and in the end, you know, much of the stuff will probably be, you know, not ruled in or ruled out. And there's a lot of things that we would like to test for that, we might not have the capacity to do as master gardeners, or even here at the Puyallup Diagnostic Lab. Like, we don't have a lot of options for viral testing. And when somebody tells you that a virus test is, screen for a tomato is going to cost you $120, well, there's a lot of tomatoes you could buy for that. So, we're not, many of us on the talk here today aren't in that kind of a budget for diagnosis kind of things. So what I tell people is, okay, first of all, growth abnormalities are often related to the plant not getting what it needs. So, if it's a little curl, if it's a little, twist or something like that, does it have the right amount of light? Does it have enough nutrients in the soil mix? Those kind of things, kind of rule out the general, cultural care types of things. But when you start, so that's sort of like the much of the picture here on the left. But when you start to get over to the really weird shaped leaves, the super twistiness on the right, and also developing on just a few leaves on the left, because these are two different situations, one indoors, one out on a porch. Once you get that really, really twisty, distorted, gosh knows whatness, sort of how my brain thinks of it. To me, we're not looking at just a stress anymore. I mean, a stress relating to growing conditions like weather, temperature, or something else has happened. And so there are a lot of other things that happen in this kind of case. So we just kind of go through a ruling it out, ruling it in type of thing. So one of the first things that we look for is the presence of herbicides. So obviously the person in their home, probably we don't have to worry too much about trying to grow vegetables in the kitchen or whatever. Probably don't have to worry about herbicides. That's, ask a couple questions. And if they say, heck no, move on, it's going to be something else. The person out here on the porch, or if it happens when it's out in the, farm or field or garden, well, that's going to be a little bit more difficult because tomatoes, in my opinion, are the canary in the mine for the various growth regulating herbicides that are out in use in landscapes, gardens, and fields. So they just get distorted for all sorts of reasons. And unfortunately, one of the really common groups that damages them is the 2,4-Ds and the dicambas. And those are found in your weed and feed types of formulations. So even if you're not doing anything, but you have a neighbor who, has that really nice lawn with no weeds in it, quite possible there could be some drift from an application. Hopefully they're doing everything they can to avoid that, but it doesn't take much and it's pretty easy to have drift happen. And then if you can rule that out, there's another source of things we need to look at. And there are a variety of long-term soil residual herbicides that work on broadleaves. And they, things like aminopyrrolid and clopyrrolid, and they're often used in hay production to keep out the weeds. Well, the label of those products in Washington and Oregon clearly states that if you apply that product to hay, you must use the hay on the farm where it was produced. And the idea is they want the people using the hay to know that there was a long-term soil residual herbicide in it, so that if the hay is fed to an animal or used for bedding, the manures and the bedding elements will probably still have the chemical in it as an active herbicide. Occasionally something goes wrong. And so we get some hay into the market in various ways, or some manures into the market in various ways that have these products in them. It would be lovely if we could easily test for it, but the tomato is probably our best bioindicator out there. It detects levels of these pesticides at very, very low levels, whereas your analytical lab test is way high. So we could test a manure or a mulch or a hay sample for the product of for the pesticide, get a no pesticide detected level, think we're safe, and use it on our tomatoes, dahlias, and other sensitive plants, and get all sorts of distortion as a result. So how do you worry about that? Well, one, whatever you can to know your sources of where stuff's coming from, to have a working relationship with people that you're, purchasing or trading or whatever you're doing to get the manures and stuff like that from, super helpful. Second of all, there is every once in a while the bad luck. And so I'm a firm believer of, that's one of those things where worrying about it isn't going to help a bit. So probably, due diligence. And then, if it does happen, well, unfortunately, it'll take a year or two or 3 or 4, depending on, what the dose is and what the soil type is like and what the environment is like, et cetera. But at a certain point, it will break down and you can go back to planting tomatoes there. But in those years that you can't, that you have to buy or produce plants in that area that are not as sensitive. So fortunately, there's a bunch of the few of the brassicas are that bad. There's lots of grain crops, et cetera. You just want to, kind of stay away from the Asteraceae and the Solanaceous family. And then there's times when you'll have some sort of virus infection, or you might have a pest that's like a broad mite where the saliva is toxic to the plant. And so that does happen. But the key feature there between the stresses that induce this and the diseases and pests that do this is the pattern of damage. And so and you can see on that picture on the right, that is pretty uniform damage. So while there are viruses that could do that, there are bugs that could do that. I mean, I'm thinking it happened quickly, apparently, according to the grower, and the uniformity of it tells me that it probably isn't going to be a disease. So that being said, there is one disease that we do worry about in the state because of things like yellowing and curling. It's the beet curly top virus, and very problematic east of the Cascade Mountains, for those of you listening from there. For those of us west of the Cascades, it does happen occasionally, but it's not that common. So the couple things that what I do trying to figure out whether we have a problem with it is I keep a pretty close eye on the beet or leafhopper numbers in eastern Washington. And so when they start to put out alerts for the growers over there, then I know, okay, some of those beet leafhoppers could potentially be, lifted up into the wind, blown across the state, and might end up here in Western Washington. Relative to tomato, what a beet leafhopper will do is it will land on a tomato. It'll do a very quick feeding probe. And then they do not find tomatoes very palatable, so they pop off and try to find something else. Well, unfortunately, if that beet leafhopper already was infested with the curly top virus, that initial feeding probe is enough to have spread the disease. So I remember the Kitsap county agent, whose name right now has been 15 years, Chris somebody or another. One year he had it in his garden, and I, told him to go out and look for beet leafhoppers. And he told me time and time again that he checked and he never found any. And that's what sent us to the literature. And we discovered that, yes, indeed, you're probably not going to find very much leafhopper damage on tomato, and you won't find leafhoppers. So if you're concerned about this, one of the other things to do is look around at the plants around your tomatoes. Look for things that beet leafhopper might be actually fond of feeding on, and check those for damage from beet leafhopper, and then you can make that connection. If you wanted to get a curly top, confirmation, my lab doesn't do any or very little virus presence confirmation, but we do have labs that we could be sent it to, and the Pullman lab run by Cassandra Bates is doing a lot of this kind of testing. You just have to fork over, $30 or $40 to figure that out. And then sadly, with the virus infections, there is no cures. So when you get it positive for a virus in your tomatoes, it's a rip that plant out and remove it, take it out. And then for one of the things you will also read a lot about in the literature is the concern about tobacco mosaic virus, TMV, in tomatoes and other solanaceous plants. And a lot of that is not really such an issue anymore. There's two reasons for that. There are fewer people smoking, but also the tobacco that's being produced for cigarettes and other tobacco products is usually now resistant to this problem, so it doesn't have it in there. And so when you read the old literature, what it would say is a smoker would get the TMV on their hands and could spread it mechanically to, you know, other members of the host plant. But fortunately now, even if you were a smoker, you are highly unlikely to have a tobacco type that had that virus in it. So that's one of the, you know, one of the nice, fewer things that we have to deal with nowadays, but there's still lots of stuff. And so like, you know, people are always looking, didn't put a picture here, but 2 years ago or right before the pandemic, you know, tomato industry was in a kerfuffle would probably be the best word for it, because there was this virus called brown rugose virus that was showing up in a lot of greenhouse grown tomatoes from various parts south of our US border. So that was a big issue because, you know, we didn't have this disease in the United States and people didn't want to, you know, accidentally get it introduced that way. And now, unfortunately, you know, the pandemic happened and all sorts of crazy stuff happened. I don't know what the status of brown rugose virus is, but I do know that it was not eradicated by any means. It's just another thing that, you know, people in the areas where that pathogen can thrive are going to have to deal with. My take on, you know, where it was that it's a lot hotter than we have it, so we probably don't have to worry about it here yet. And then the last 10 minutes of the day, I wanted to talk a little bit about the other disease problems, because that's what I do see quite a bit once it starts heating up around here. And wanted to remind everybody that a plant disease is really a dynamic interaction of three main factors. So in order to have a plant disease, you need to have a pathogen present. That pathogen must be interacting with a susceptible host plant. And at the point of that interaction, there has got to be an environment that's conducive for the establishment of the disease. So, you know, there's all sorts of different ways you can influence these kind of options. Like if you see a plant that's getting sick, prune off that part of the plant, remove the pathogen inoculum, may stop the problem altogether. If you're, you know, looking through the seed catalog, trying to decide what tomatoes to buy for your area, and you find one that says, you know, maybe you've had a problem in your area with some verticillium wilt issues, so you're concerned it might be in the organism might be in your soil, and you find one that says verticillium wilt resistant, hey, good idea to try that, you know, provided it grows in our environment here. And then conducive environment is probably where much of our control is. So this is things like how long do the leaves stay wet? And you can influence that by spacing, by timing of your watering, method of watering. If you're indoors in like a hoop house or in a greenhouse, maybe there'll be things you can do with fans or pruning of leaves in order to get air circulation going on. And so there's lots of different stuff. And then if you were needing to use a pesticide, like a fungicide or something like that, that's back on that conducive environment. You would coat the plant surfaces so that they were no longer, you know, the pathogen was no longer able to get inside the plant. So for example, the picture here in this slide is the white mold sclerotinia fungus. It is a pretty nasty fungus in that a couple of things. It has a pretty large host range. So many members of the Solanaceous family, as well as the Asteraceae family. So, you know, probably 2/3 of what you're growing in your garden will get that. Also things like, you know, flowers, sunflowers, weeds like dandelions can get it and harbor it. And then once it gets into the plant, it forms all this white sporulation that you can see on the surfaces there, but it also creates these hard structures called sclerotia. And those can fall into the soil and last for, you know, long periods of time, 5, 6, 7, 8 years or something like that. So this tomato is definitely damaged. There was, you know, it was wilting, it was turning yellow. And of course, it when sent to me, it was sporulating and stuff like that. So I was like, okay, you need to remove as much of the material as you can. And then, you know, talk to the grower. And it turned out one of their big issues was crop rotation. You know, they've been growing a lot of very susceptible plants in the same place year after year after year. They had noticed a bit of weakening of plants, the year previous. And so, I have my little, soapbox where, I understand that growing the same plants year after year after year for practical reasons, because that's where it grows best, because of cropping rotations, that's what you get the money for, desirability, that's what you want to grow, is perfectly understandable. But from a disease or pest type of issue, that's just not a great idea. So definitely would want to be rotating out of there, keeping a very good eye on the host range for this disease. And then just a couple things that you may or may not see in your gardening. So gray mold, super common on tomatoes, super common on all sorts of plants. As many of you right now have hostas that are showing leaf spots from a purchase of some plants, and that leaf spot on those hostas is gray mold. I just last night forced myself to stay up and take care of the first batch of strawberries that I bought at a farmer's market. And the main reason was I could just see myself, crying if 20 bucks worth of strawberries turn into gray moldy disasters. So the gray mold fungus is, it's awfully adorable, as you can see in this picture, kind of in the middle there with those little cluster of grapes, hence the name botrytis, because that's, I guess, means cluster like grapes. But it's going to get in on a lot of different types of tissue. So tomato in and of itself is susceptible, but it's super susceptible if there's poor air circulation, if the stems and the leaves stay wet a long time, and any type of wounding. So where we see it a lot coming into our lab is usually indoor production, so hoop house or greenhouse, and often related to how plants are staked. So if the plants are staked in a way that there is some abrasion to the stems, like the, El Cheapo twine is used and rubbing around and there's wounding, gray mold really loves that kind of wound, plus all the humidity. So when you start to see the white or gray or white fungal coating there, something has gone wrong. And as you can see on these pictures, those are major, major vines. And so you're not going to get, much production past that. So this is one where doing everything you can to try to avoid gray mold is really, really important. And fortunately, if you're growing outdoors, usually there's enough air circulation and stuff like that, that it's not so much of a problem. And so then again, we just wanted to remind you that that disease triangle is what we're trying to get at when we talk about management. And so if you go to, say, the greenhouse tomato page of the P&W handbook, or for the master gardeners in the audience, the WSU HortSense, what you're going to see is you're going to see a variety of different recommendations targeting each one of these different circles. So, are there cultural things you can do, such as remove the pathogen, prune it out. If you saw a seedling coming up and it doesn't look very good, just rogue it from the beginning, because it's probably, if it starts out looking sick, it probably isn't going to get healthier from then on out. Is there things you could have done, like buy a resistant plant, or planted it at a timing when the problem wasn't going to get it? So, again, a lot of our, some of our diseases happen because plants are struggling out in the cold and the wet when they really want to be tropical. And so that might be an issue. And then anything you can do to the environment. So the point being is that there's little tiny things that we can do all along. And then we can, manage it in little bits of time. And so we end up with a, crop that we want, plus not too much time spent, or energy or money or whatever spending our time managing issues. So a couple of the common fungal diseases you will see in Washington on your tomatoes are a variety of different leaf spots. Many of them are alternaria fungi. And the one on the top left here is a picture of Alternaria alternata, which is just a lot of little tiny spots all over the place. It goes by the common name brown leaf spot. It's a problem on both potato and tomato. And it's probably our biggest issue leaf spot wise of either host in Western Washington. And what it does is the plant's usually under some stress. You maybe haven't fertilized enough. You can see that particular plant is suffering some pretty serious nutrient stress too. And then this pretty weak pathogen comes in. Disease on the left, but on the bottom is early blight, and that's one that makes it into a lot of the literature. It's another alternaria disease, but one very, very host specific to tomato, potato, alternaria solani. And you'll see necrotic lesions in rings. And so we don't actually have very much of this pathogen or in Western Washington, or we don't have the environment that makes it very, what do you call it? Problematic over here. But for anybody listening from the east side, that is a disease you're going to have to deal with. And then I'll show you a picture of late blight. That is early blight. There's a problem called late blight. And I think those are horrible common names. And I wish that plant pathologists would finally just decide to get rid of those names and call them, something that's more meaningful, because it doesn't often make sense in terms of timing in our environments. The powdery mildew pictured on the top right is there's a couple of different powdery mildews in the state of Washington that will impact tomato. Fortunately, we don't have a ton of problems out in field and garden, but they can be much more problematic when you're growing in a hoop house, or all of a sudden my brain just can't remember what the name of hoop house, probably, or greenhouse, the high tunnel, sorry, that's the word I was going for, high tunnel something production. And the reason there is powdery mildews really, really like humidity. They don't like free water. So, rain is going to wash off the spores and cause them to explode, but humidity is going to promote the growth of the spores. And then at the bottom, there's a picture from a hoop house of a tomato that just kind of looks all grayish all over the place. And this is actually a coating of fungus, looks similar to, it's got some name now, I can't even remember what it's called, but it's always traditionally been called fulva or leaf mold. I've never once seen it come in from somebody's outside garden or outside field, but it's super common when you enclose the plants, either in a greenhouse or a hoop house or a high tunnel. And again, it's an organism that's out and about, and yet when you give it the right environment, it will thrive. Fortunately, both powdery mildew and leaf mold aren't that damaging to the plant. They just, they rob it of some of its energy. So your production may slow a little bit, but they don't tend to kill the plant, similar to the things we're going to talk about next. Oops. So late blight. Late blight of Phytophthora infestans is not really even a fungal infection. It's an oomycete disease. And, you're familiar with it because it caused the Irish potato famine all those years ago. So you've read about it in history. But back in the 1990s, the pathogen escaped its center of origins somewhere in Mexico. And when it reestablished throughout the world, the strains that came in this migration were highly aggressive against tomatoes. So the late blight of potatoes issue hadn't really harmed tomatoes at all. But this one is aggressive and very against tomatoes and pretty fast moving. The key features that make late blight thrive is leaf wetness duration. So dewy nights are what's going to take the plant down if the pathogen is in the environment. And one of the quickest ways to tell if you've got late blight or something else is, unfortunately, I have often, somebody asks me on a Friday afternoon, so what will I see on Monday morning if I go out and look at that field again? And I'm like, there probably won't be anything left. Tactfulness is sometimes not my best strength. It's very, very aggressive. But if you were going to see an early infection, what you'd be looking for is kind of a velvety sporulation around the dark lesions. And it's easiest to find that early in the morning when it's nice and humid. So take a look then. But I'm a firm believer that this is a community type of issue because, if it's in the environment, it can spread on wind and water. And so, keep your eyes out for it. Let people know if you're experiencing it. Definitely give me a call. There's a disease forecasting system in east of the Cascades about this problem, and it works, and it only works well. It works really well, but it only works well if people report that they're having a problem, because what it takes into is environment plus whether the pathogen's been identified as being present or not. We're very blessed in the United States because we don't have to worry about the soil stage of this particular fungus. We have clonal lineages, which are asexual, so no oospores are produced. So we don't have a soil-borne stage of it. But unfortunately, year after year after year after year, it keeps getting reintroduced throughout the state and throughout the United States on things like overwintering in coal piles, volunteer potato and tomato plants. Sometimes it will come in on seedlings if they were from infected seed, those kind of things. So we need to keep an eye on it and aggressively, pruning it out. If your management philosophies allow for fungicides, there are fungicides that can protect it from growing into the plant. There's not much resistance yet in the tomato industry, but it's the holy grail. Eventually they will figure out a way to get you some resistance and you can start growing tomatoes like that. And then everything you do to manage humidity would really, really help. And then there's just a couple long-term diseases we want you to avoid. Are the wilt diseases for verticillium and fusarium wilt. And you'll see here the picture on the left, that classic one-sided nature of verticillium wilt. So half of the water conducting tissue is plugged up with a pathogen. The other half seems to be somewhat normal. I mean, that's a gorgeous picture, but what really happens is you see this, like in the middle there, where there's a lot of necrosis and you got to really look hard to figure it out. There's some vascular discoloration that's going on, and it's pretty easy for me to plate out onto agar. So if you get me a sample, I can tell you. Tomatoes are fairly susceptible. Eggplant are highly susceptible. So if you're growing eggplant at the same time and you see the problem, they are, that's a real good indicator plant. And then the reason that you're really concerned is this is on the right there is a picture of the organism growing on agar. So I mean, we're looking at probably a half a centimeter slice of that agar right there. So not much, it's all highly magnified, but you can see all those little black specks growing in the agar. Each one of those black specks is something called a mycosclerotia. And when it forms on plant tissue and then decays into the soil, it has the ability to, contribute to years of the pathogen being present in that soil. So we want to avoid that. And there's a huge host range for verticillium and fusariums. Although the more we know about some of the genetics, the more we realize that there's a lot of strains out there. But in general, for the capacity that we have to do testing and to do identification in farms, gardens, and here at the lab, it's best just to be like, okay, assume that it's a pretty broad spectrum. So rotate your crops, make sure your plants look healthy, do those kind of things to try to avoid verticillium wilt. Fusarium wilt is another wilting organism that gets into the vascular tissue and clogs it up. More common in warmer areas. So, those of you calling in from the Squim area or Eastern Washington, Central Washington, probably have more of an issue with that than we do. Pretty much all the same story, except for it doesn't have the mycosclerotia part of it, but it also has a bunch of overwintering structures that allow the pathogenic types of fusarium to last in the soil for long periods of time. And one of the other things about fusariums is they're everywhere. Every soil will have them. Not all of them will be pathogenic. So it is actually just a total, nightmare. And in fact, I was so proud of myself this week because we had some question about fusariums on, of all things, tulips. And I was like, I don't know the answer to this, but I know somebody who could answer it. And so our researcher, Dr. Chastegner, basically told, USDA that their project was a wonderful idea, but totally impractical because there was just no way that we could figure out whether it was strain specific or not in a reasonable manner. And so it was an interesting practicality meets science type of interaction I was involved in. And then a lot of times what will happen is we'll get these, what's going on. And there's just so much in this picture that it would be very, very difficult to, diagnose from a photo alone. So that's why we recommend samples. But also when you look out, the other thing is there's, lots is going on here. So I am a firm understanding that this is not how that farmer wanted this, field or hoop house or whatever it is, I can't remember now, to look, because there's weeds and it's not been pruned very well. And there's, plants that are sunburning and fruit that's sunburning and all sorts of stuff. I'm a total understanding that this is simply life happens and you can't do it all. But I wanted to include this picture just because there's so much going on here that has to do with what we've talked about for the last hour. So like some of those weeds are going to be harboring pests and pathogens. There's a cull pile where maybe something's going to overwinter. Was the plants were they spaced so close that they couldn't, keep up with things? Maybe some spacing would have helped get air circulation around. I mean, there's just a whole bunch of stuff that you can do. You can see that on some of these pictures, it looks like there's some twining. So, so they're probably trying to stake it up. Could that be wounding the plant, causing a disease to get in there? And, just really sad that, this plant and this person have invested so much to get the tomatoes to that size, and yet they have nothing for that particular thing. So again, remember that triangle of think, plan, do. Make sure that some realism is not just dreams are involved when you're doing your tomato work. And then didn't talk a lot about pesticides today, but they are a part of any integrated pest management strategy. Everybody has their own things that they're willing to do. I know most of you will be thinking about protecting our environment and our pollinators. But I also wanted to just remind people that we really need the master gardeners and the farmers of Washington keeping out for things, because there's all sorts of times when there will be new stuff. So this little stink bug right here is the southern green stink bug. It's absolutely glamorous as a nymph or a young, with all sorts of different colorations and gorgeous spots. But alas and alack, it feeds on tomato and a whole host of stuff. And so when it was first picked up in the Seattle area, it was not good news. We had a lot of green stink bugs, and they're native, but this was something totally different. And so, keep your eye out for something new. The first time I ever saw tobacco budworm in the middle there, it feeds on almost all of our west side petunias and other members of that plant. So obviously tomatoes and potatoes as well. But, it had been a problem for a while over in the Spokane area and stuff like that. And now it's widespread. So we need you guys looking for what's out there and stuff like that. You have to be pretty close observers. And with that, I'll thank you for listening to me. I'm definitely going to stick around for some questions. Sorry, I didn't actually have a slot of 5 minutes or 10 minutes to answer these questions. But this is the contact information for the lab, and both my email and Cassandra Bates, our diagnostician, email. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. It looks like we have one question in the chat box. So it says, I seem to have an herbicide contamination in my greenhouse, either drift or in the soil. What now? Remove the pots and soil, sterilize the pots, replace the soil, try again? Do I need to sterilize the greenhouse itself?
Okay. So, the question, sorry about that. Sounds like a horrible thing. The question I would ask first is, where do you think the herbicide came from? Why do you think it's a herbicide at that point? And then, basically, if it is a herbicide, if it was drift, it depends on the type of chemistry and stuff like that. So a lot of like 2,4-D and dicamba, very short half-life in the soil, pretty quick half-life in the plant. So it'll take it up and then move on. Now, if you're growing organic, unfortunately, that's more than you wanted. So that's a whole, ethics decision right there. But a lot of the chemistries that, you can just wait it out because they will break down with water, microactivity, heat. And usually you don't have to worry about sterilizing pots, soils, et cetera. Time is in your essence there. But one of the other things I often will do when samples come in where I'm querying about this is I will pull out the tomato, I'll wash all the soil off the tomato root system. I'll pot it into some standard potting mix and see if it's, starts to grow better. It only take like, if it's somebody's dandelion application drifting across the fence, that usually takes about 3 weeks and the plants pop out just fine. So the answer is kind of, it depends, and, don't hesitate to call or email me with, more specific details. Anything else people want to ask right now?
I don't see anything else that has come in, Jenny, other than a few thank yous. Let's see, let's go to any other questions, folks? So, Kendra, interrupt me if something does come in, please.
Absolutely.
At this point, I want to thank Jenny for being with us today. Unfortunately, growing tomatoes and other things is not for the faint of heart. I think that we as gardeners, need to stay on top of things and simply be alert to our plantings, no matter what they are. And of course, I don't think a tomato crop can ever be perfectly trouble-free. So thank you for sharing your information about what you see in your QL at Plant Clinic. Again, I wanted to just add this slide so people can look for the recording, and also Jenny's resource list will be attached to that, and Jenny can be reached at that address. If you have questions later on, do reach out to the Plant Clinic. Our infamous coordinator is very happy to pass those tomato questions on to, I guess, the tomato team that usually can find reasonable answers to those questions. So any other questions from our audience?
I don't see any.
Can I jump in and just
Absolutely,
specifically
Laura.
for farmers, this recording will also be put on the regional small farms website, and I can put that in the chat box. Oops, that was a direct message. I'll put it in the chat box in a minute. For farmers, if you have questions, you can, or anybody, if you're asking Jenny directly, there is a on the lab website, and Jenny might be able to speak more to this. There is paperwork that you'll need to fill out to submit a sample. If you're a farmer, you can also go to the WSU Regional Small Farms website and look for the button for technical assistance, and type in your problem there, and that will it will come to me, and oftentimes I forward those to Jenny, or if it's something not related to plant disease, we'll forward it on to whoever can best help you. So that's for farmers.
Thanks, Laurel. And thank you, Jenny, again for assisting us or presenting today. I'd like to remind our participants that as they leave, they will be asked to respond to a couple of different surveys. And please, we would enjoy your feedback. So with that, let's say goodbye to our participants. Let's see, Kendra, would you please just hold on?